He didn't realize it at first, but the moment everything began to feel off was the exact moment everything was quietly beginning to change. Not collapse, not fall apart in the way he feared, but rearrange itself beneath the surface in ways he couldn't yet see. And that is the cruel beauty of these moments. Because when life begins to shift, it rarely announces itself with clarity. It comes disguised as confusion, as fatigue, as a strange heaviness that follows you even into the quietest parts of your day. And he felt it, that subtle weight pressing on his thoughts, turning simple decisions into exhausting ones, making things that once felt meaningful now feel mechanical, like he was moving but not progressing, breathing but not really alive. And the scariest part wasn't the discomfort itself, it was how easy it would have been to ignore it, to label it as just another bad phase, another stretch of tired days, something to push through without questioning. Because that is what he had always done. Keep going, stay productive, don't stop long enough to look inward. But something about this time was different. Something inside him refused to be silenced. It whispered at first, barely noticeable, a quiet nudge that something wasn't aligned. And then it lingered, growing just enough that he couldn't fully distract himself from it, even when he tried. Even when he filled his time with noise and motion and obligation, it remained there, waiting, patient, persistent, like a truth that understood it didn't need to shout to be heard. And slowly, almost unwillingly, he began to realize that this feeling wasn't the enemy he had assumed it to be. It wasn't there to break him, it was there to wake him up. And that realization didn't come as a sudden breakthrough or a dramatic moment of clarity. It came gradually, in fragments, in quiet pauses between thoughts, in the spaces where he stopped trying to fix everything and simply noticed what was happening within him. Because for the first time, he allowed himself to admit that something was off, not in a way that demanded immediate correction, but in a way that invited curiosity. And that small shift changed everything. Because instead of reacting, he started observing. Instead of fighting the discomfort, he began to sit with it. And what he found there was not weakness, not failure, but depth. Layers of himself he had been too busy to acknowledge, emotions he had postponed, questions he had avoided. And it became clear that the discomfort wasn't random. It was accumulated, built over time from moments he overlooked, choices he made on autopilot, paths he followed without asking if they still made sense. And now, all of it had surfaced at once, not to overwhelm him, but to be seen, truly seen. And that is when he understood something most people spend their lives running from, that hitting a low point is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of awareness, the point where the illusion of control starts to crack, and something more honest takes its place. And honesty can feel brutal at first, because it strips away the narratives we hide behind, the excuses that keep us comfortable, the identities we've outgrown but still cling to. And standing in that space, with nothing to hide behind, is terrifying. But it is also the only place real change can begin, because you cannot transform what you refuse to acknowledge. And so he stayed there, not because it was easy, but because something in him knew that leaving too soon would mean repeating the same cycle again. And he was tired of cycles, tired of temporary fixes, tired of convincing himself that things would improve without actually confronting what needed to change. And so he allowed himself to go deeper, to stop skimming the surface of his own life, and instead dive beneath it, into the parts that didn't make sense, into the questions that didn't have immediate answers, into the silence that most people avoid. And at first, it felt like sinking, like losing control, like drifting further away from clarity. But slowly, something shifted, because the deeper he went, the more he began to understand that he wasn't drowning, he was discovering the patterns that shaped his behavior, the beliefs that limited his perspective, the habits that kept him stuck in versions of himself he no longer wanted to be. And it wasn't comfortable, not even close, but it was real. And there is a kind of strength that only comes from facing reality without filters, without denial, without rushing to escape it. And in that space, stripped of distraction, he began to reconnect with something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of presence, of actually being in his life instead of just moving through it. And it made him realize how long he had been operating on autopilot, chasing outcomes without questioning the direction, measuring progress without defining purpose. And now, for the first time, he He wasn't trying to get somewhere else. He was trying to understand where he already was. And that shift, though subtle, changed the way he experienced everything. Because instead of seeing his current state as a problem to solve, he began to see it as a message to interpret. And messages require attention, not avoidance, patience, not urgency. And so he slowed down, not in the sense of doing less, but in the sense of becoming more aware, more intentional, more present with each thought, each reaction, each feeling that arose. And what he found was that beneath the noise, beneath the confusion, beneath the discomfort, there was clarity waiting. Not the kind that answers every question instantly, but the kind that guides you one step at a time. And that was enough, more than enough. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to leap ahead. He was willing to take a single step, to trust that even the smallest movement forward was still movement. And that realization carried a quiet power, because it removed the pressure to have everything figured out, to know exactly where he was going, to fix everything at once, and replaced it with something far more sustainable, the willingness to begin. And beginning is often the hardest part, not because it requires more effort, but because it requires more honesty, the kind that forces you to admit where you are before you can decide where you want to go. And so he stood there, at the edge of something new, not with certainty, not with complete confidence, but with awareness. And that awareness was enough to change the trajectory of everything that followed. Because once you see clearly, you cannot go back to seeing blindly. Once you recognize that your lowest point is not a dead end, but a turning point, you begin to approach it differently. Not with fear, but with a strange sense of respect. Because you understand that it holds within it the very thing you've been searching for. Not answers handed to you, but the opportunity to discover them for yourself. And that is where his journey truly began. Not in the moments when everything made sense, but in the moments when nothing did, and he chose to stay anyway, to listen, to learn, and to trust that even in the absence of clarity, something meaningful was unfolding beneath the surface, preparing him for a version of himself he had not yet met, but was slowly becoming. And yet the deeper he went, the more undeniable it became that what he had once called confusion was actually communication, something within him attempting to be heard after being ignored for far too long. And the realization didn't arrive with comfort, it arrived with a quiet unease, the kind that forces you to sit still, even when every instinct tells you to move, to distract, to escape. Because for most of his life, he had trained himself to respond to discomfort with action, to fix, to solve, to push forward as if speed alone could outrun whatever truth was trying to catch up to him. But this time was different. This time, the more he tried to override the feeling, the stronger it seemed to return. Not louder, not aggressive, but persistent, like a steady knock on a door he had kept closed. And eventually, he understood that the door was not meant to stay shut, that the discomfort wasn't there to be silenced, it was there to be understood. And that shift in perspective marked the beginning of a different kind of effort. Not the effort of doing more, but the effort of listening, truly listening, without immediately judging or correcting what he found. And that was unfamiliar territory, because listening requires patience, it requires space, it requires the willingness to sit with things that don't make sense yet. And so he slowed himself down enough to notice the patterns beneath the surface, the way certain thoughts repeated themselves, the way certain situations triggered the same emotional responses, the way his energy fluctuated depending on where he directed his attention. And it became clear that what felt random was anything but random. It was structured, patterned, almost predictable in hindsight, as if his internal world had been speaking a language all along, and he was only now beginning to understand its vocabulary. And with that understanding came a realization that was both empowering and unsettling, that many of the things he had blamed on external circumstances were in fact reflections of internal imbalance, not in a way that placed blame on himself, but in a way that returned responsibility to him. Because if the source was within, then so was the potential for change. And that idea carried weight, because it meant he could no longer wait for the world to adjust itself to his needs. He had to learn how to adjust himself in relation to the world, and that required a level of honesty he had rarely practiced. The kind that doesn't allow excuses to soften the truth, the kind that asks questions without immediately searching for comfortable answers. And so, he began to ask himself things he had avoided for years. not in a harsh or accusatory tone, but in a curious one. Questions about why certain things no longer fulfilled him, why he felt drained in places that once energized him, why he continued to hold on to routines that no longer aligned with who he was becoming. And each question opened another layer, revealing not a single problem to fix, but a network of small misalignments that had accumulated over time. Subtle shifts that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively created a sense of disconnection he could no longer ignore. And instead of rushing to correct everything at once, he allowed himself to observe without interference, to see the full picture before attempting to change it. And that restraint was difficult, because there is a natural urge to act as soon as you identify something that feels wrong. But he was beginning to understand that premature action often leads to superficial solutions, the kind that temporarily mask the discomfort without addressing its source. And he no longer wanted temporary relief. He wanted understanding, because understanding creates lasting change. And so he stayed with the process, even when it felt slow, even when it felt uncertain, trusting that clarity would emerge if he gave it enough space. And slowly, it did, not as a sudden revelation, but as a series of small insights that began to connect, forming a clearer image of what had been hidden beneath the surface. And one of the most important things he realized was that not everything that felt wrong needed to be eliminated. Some things needed to be reinterpreted. Because discomfort is not always a sign of misdirection. Sometimes it is a sign of growth, a signal that you are stepping beyond the boundaries of your previous self. And the challenge lies in distinguishing between the discomfort that comes from misalignment and the discomfort that comes from expansion. And that distinction can only be made through awareness, through careful attention to what you feel and why you feel it. And so he paid attention, not just to the intensity of his emotions, but to their origin, their pattern, their consistency over time. And in doing so, he began to separate noise from signal, temporary reactions from deeper truths. And that separation gave him something he hadn't had before: clarity. Not perfect clarity, not a complete map of where he was going, but enough clarity to take a step without second-guessing himself. And that step, though small, carried a different kind of confidence. Not the loud, outward confidence that demands certainty, but a quiet, internal confidence that comes from understanding. The kind that doesn't need validation because it is rooted in awareness. And with that awareness came a shift in how he approached himself. Less criticism, more curiosity. Less urgency, more patience. Because he began to see that the version of himself he had been frustrated with was not broken. It was simply operating based on outdated information, patterns that had once served him but no longer fit the context of who he was becoming. And instead of rejecting that version of himself, he chose to understand it, to appreciate the role it had played in getting him this far, and to gently guide it towards something new. And that process required compassion, the kind that recognizes that growth is not about erasing the past, but about integrating it, learning from it, building upon it, and moving forward with a deeper sense of self-awareness. And as he continued to listen, to observe, to question without rushing to answer, he began to notice a subtle but profound change in how he experienced his days. Moments that once felt heavy began to feel manageable, not because the external circumstances had changed, but because his relationship to them had shifted. He was no longer reacting automatically. He was responding intentionally. And that difference created space. Space between stimulus and response. Space to choose. Space to align his actions with his understanding rather than his impulses. And in that space, he found a sense of control that did not rely on controlling everything around him, but on understanding how he engaged with it. And that realization was liberating, because it removed the pressure to fix the world and replaced it with the opportunity to understand himself within it. And understanding himself became the priority, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice, something he returned to consistently, refining it, deepening it, allowing it to evolve as he did. And through that practice, he discovered that the voice he had once ignored, the quiet signal beneath the noise, was not something separate from him. It was him, the most honest part of him, the part that existed before expectations, before conditioning, before the layers of identity he had accumulated over time. And reconnecting with that part of himself did not solve every problem. It did not eliminate uncertainty or difficulty, but it changed the way he moved through them, with more awareness, more intention, more alignment. And that alignment created a sense of momentum, Not forced, not rushed, but natural, like a current that carries you forward when you stop fighting against it. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to escape where he was trying to understand it. And in understanding it, he was already beginning to move beyond it, not by force, but by clarity, not by resistance, but by acceptance. And that acceptance was not passive, it was active. It was the foundation upon which real change could be built, because you cannot transform what you refuse to acknowledge. And now, finally, he was acknowledging everything, the discomfort, the uncertainty, the questions without answers. And instead of seeing them as obstacles, he began to see them as guides, leading him toward a version of himself that was more aligned, more aware, and more capable of navigating whatever came next. And it was from that growing awareness that something unexpectedly simple, yet profoundly powerful, began to take shape. A realization so small on the surface that it would be easy to overlook, yet so fundamental that it had the potential to change everything. Because after all the overthinking, all the searching, all the questioning, he came to understand that progress did not begin with a grand breakthrough. It began with a single action, one step, one attempt, one moment where intention met execution. And what made this realization so striking was how long he had complicated the idea of moving forward, convincing himself that he needed clarity before action, confidence before risk, certainty before commitment, when in reality, the sequence had always been the opposite. Action created clarity, risk built confidence, and movement revealed direction. But he had been waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect version of himself to arrive before he allowed himself to begin. And that waiting had kept him still far longer than he realized, not because he lacked ability, but because he misunderstood the nature of progress itself. And once that misunderstanding began to dissolve, he saw things differently. He no longer viewed the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be as something that needed to be crossed all at once. Instead, he saw it as a series of small, repeatable steps, each one insignificant on its own, but transformative when compounded over time. And this perspective removed a weight he had been carrying for years. The pressure to do something extraordinary right away, to prove something immediately, to justify his ambitions with instant results. And without that pressure, something else emerged: willingness. A willingness to try without needing to guarantee success. A willingness to act without needing to eliminate uncertainty. And so he took that first step, not with complete confidence, not with a flawless plan, but with enough understanding to know that waiting any longer would only keep him where he was. And that step, though small, changed something within him, because it provided evidence, not theoretical evidence, not imagined potential, but real, tangible proof that movement was possible, that he was capable of initiating change. And that proof carried a kind of power that no amount of thinking could replicate. Because once you experience something directly, it alters your perception in a way that cannot be undone. And suddenly, the question that had once dominated his mind, the question of whether or not he could do something, began to fade, replaced by a different question entirely. One that shifted his focus from possibility to process, from doubt to execution. And that question was simple: how can I do this again? How can I take what just worked, no matter how small, and build upon it, refine it, repeat it? And that shift marked the beginning of momentum. Not explosive, not dramatic, but steady, consistent, grounded in reality rather than expectation. And as he continued to act, to test, to adjust, he began to notice patterns forming. Certain approaches yielding better results, certain habits reinforcing progress, certain mindsets supporting consistency, and what once felt like chaos began to take on structure. Not because everything was under control, but because he was engaging with it differently. He was no longer standing on the outside, trying to figure everything out before participating. He was inside the process, learning through experience, adapting in real time. And that involvement changed his relationship with failure as well. Because failure was no longer a final verdict on his ability. It was feedback, information that guided his next step, something to be used rather than feared. And that perspective allowed him to move more freely, to experiment without the constant weight of judgment, to explore without the need for immediate validation. And in that freedom, he found something he hadn't expected: enjoyment, a sense of engagement with the process itself, rather than just the outcome. And that made consistency easier, because he was no longer forcing himself to endure the journey for the sake of a distant result. He was participating in it with curiosity, with presence, with a growing appreciation for the small victories that marked his progress. And those victories, though often overlooked by others, became significant to him because they represented movement, proof that he was no longer stuck, proof that he was building something, even if it wasn't yet visible in its final form. And over time, those small actions began to accumulate, creating a foundation that felt more stable than anything he had built before. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, grounded in action rather than intention alone. And with that foundation came a new level of confidence, not the kind that claims to know everything, but the kind that trusts in its ability to figure things out along the way. And that trust changed how he approached challenges. Instead of hesitating, he engaged. Instead of questioning his capability, he tested it. And through that testing, he continued to gather evidence, reinforcing the belief that he could move forward, that he could adapt, that he could grow. And that belief was not based on blind optimism. It was based on experience, on repeated action, on the simple but powerful truth that he had already done it once. And if something can be done once, it can be done again, and again, and again, until what was once unfamiliar becomes natural, until what once required effort becomes habit. And that is when he understood the deeper meaning behind the idea of starting with one. Because one is not just a number, it is a threshold, a point of transition from possibility to reality, from thinking to doing, from imagining to experiencing. And crossing that threshold changes everything, because it removes the illusion that something is out of reach and replaces it with the understanding that it is simply a matter of repetition, refinement, and persistence. And with that understanding, the scale of his goals no longer intimidated him in the same way, because he no longer saw them as distant endpoints. He saw them as extensions of the same process, the same steps, the same actions, multiplied over time. And that made them feel accessible, not easy, but achievable. And that distinction mattered, because easy implies a lack of effort, while achievable acknowledges the effort while still affirming the possibility. And he was no longer searching for ease, he was committed to progress. And progress, he now knew, did not require perfection, it required participation, consistent, intentional participation in the process of becoming. And so he continued, step by step, action by action, building not just results, but a new relationship with himself, one based on trust, on evidence, on the understanding that he did not need to have everything figured out to move forward. He just needed to be willing to take the next step, and then the next, and then the next. And in doing so, he was no longer waiting for change to happen. He was creating it, one small action at a time, and that was enough to carry him into whatever came next. And as that momentum quietly began to build, he found himself standing in front of something he had spent most of his life trying to avoid, something that no longer appeared as an abstract idea, but as a very real, unavoidable presence in his path. The hard thing, the very thing he once believed was meant to be bypassed, minimized, or delayed until he felt ready. And yet now it stood there, unchanged, unmoved by his hesitation, unaffected by his past strategies of avoidance. And for the first time, he began to see it not as an interruption to his progress, but as an essential part of it, because every step forward he had taken so far had led him here, not around it, not away from it, but directly toward it. And that realization carried a strange mixture of resistance and understanding, because even with all the awareness he had gained, even with the evidence he had built through action, there was still a part of him that wanted to retreat, that whispered that maybe he could find another way, an easier way, a more comfortable path that would allow him to keep progressing without confronting what felt so uncertain, so demanding, so exposing. But another part of him, quieter yet far more grounded, understood something different, understood that the path he was searching for did not exist, because this was the path, this confrontation, this moment of standing face to face with difficulty, without the option of escape. And so he stayed, not because he felt fearless, but because he was beginning to understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move despite it, And that decision, though simple in theory, required a level of commitment that went beyond motivation. It required him to trust in everything he had learned up to this point. To trust that the discomfort he was feeling was not a signal to stop, but a signal that he was approaching something meaningful, something that had the potential to reshape him in ways comfort never could. And so instead of turning away, he took a step closer. And what he discovered in that moment was that the hard thing was not as clearly defined as he had imagined. It was not a single obstacle with clear boundaries. It was a process, a series of challenges, uncertainties, and unfamiliar experiences that unfolded as he moved through them. And that made it even more daunting, because it meant there was no clear endpoint, no guarantee of when it would become easier, no assurance that the effort would immediately translate into results. And yet, within that uncertainty there was also opportunity. The opportunity to grow in ways that could not be simulated or rehearsed. The opportunity to develop resilience, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And as he continued forward, he began to notice something subtle but powerful. That each step through the difficulty revealed something new, not just about the situation he was facing, but about himself, about his capacity to endure, to adapt, to learn in real time. And these realizations did not arrive all at once. They accumulated, layer by layer, each one reinforcing the understanding that he was capable of more than he had previously believed. Not because he had suddenly become stronger, but because he was finally allowing himself to engage with the very experiences that demanded strength. And that engagement changed everything. Because strength is not built in the absence of challenge. It is built through interaction with it, through repeated exposure to situations that stretch your limits, challenge your assumptions, and force you to operate beyond your comfort zone. And as he continued to move through this process, he began to redefine what the hard thing meant to him. It was no longer just something to endure. It was something to learn from, something to use, something that contained within it the very tools he needed to move forward. And that shift in perspective transformed his relationship with difficulty, because instead of viewing it as an external force acting against him, he began to see it as an internal catalyst, something that activated growth, that revealed potential, that pushed him toward a version of himself that could not be accessed any other way. And with that understanding came a new kind of focus, not on avoiding discomfort, but on navigating it effectively, on paying attention to what each challenge was teaching him, on extracting value from each experience rather than simply trying to survive it. And this approach required presence. It required him to stay engaged, even when things felt overwhelming, to resist the urge to disconnect or numb himself, to remain aware of what was happening within him as much as what was happening around him. And in doing so, he developed a deeper level of control. Not control over the external circumstances, which often remained unpredictable and complex, but control over his response to them, over how he interpreted them, over how he chose to move through them. And that control was empowering, because it meant that even in the midst of uncertainty, even in the presence of difficulty, he was not powerless. He had agency. He had the ability to influence his experience through his perspective and his actions. And that realization gave him the confidence to continue, not because he expected the path to become easier, but because he understood that he was becoming more capable, more adaptable, more resilient with each step he took. And as that capability grew, so did his willingness to face even greater challenges, not out of a need to prove himself, but out of a recognition that growth existed on the other side of those challenges, that each hard thing was not a barrier, but a bridge, a transition point between who he was and who he was becoming. And that perspective changed the way he approached fear as well, because fear was no longer something to eliminate, it was something to interpret, a signal that he was stepping into unfamiliar territory, that he was expanding beyond his previous limits. And instead of allowing fear to stop him, he used it as a guide, a marker that indicated where growth was most likely to occur. And this approach did not remove the discomfort. It did not make the process painless or easy, but it made it meaningful. It gave purpose to the struggle, context to the difficulty, and that meaning made it possible to continue even when the outcome was uncertain, even when progress felt slow, even when the results were not immediately visible, because he was no longer measuring success solely by external achievements. He was measuring it by internal development, by the ways in which he was changing, learning, evolving through the process itself. And that shift in measurement allowed him to appreciate the journey in a way he never had before. to recognize that the value of the hard thing was not just in what it led to, but in what it required him to become in order to move through it. And that realization anchored him, gave him a sense of direction that did not depend on external validation. And with that anchor, he continued forward, step by step, challenge by challenge, no longer seeking to avoid difficulty, but willing to engage with it fully, to move through it with intention, to extract from it everything it had to offer, understanding now that the hard thing was not there to stop him, it was there to shape him, to refine him, to prepare him for everything that lay ahead. And in that understanding, he found a kind of strength that could not be taken away, because it was not given by circumstance, it was built through it. And just when it seemed like he had learned how to move, how to listen, how to face difficulty and grow through it, he encountered something far more subtle, far more deceptive, something that did not feel like an obstacle at all, but rather like a reward, a sense of stability, of things being fine, manageable, even comfortable. And for a moment it felt like this was what he had been working toward all along, a place where nothing was falling apart, where there was no urgent pressure to change, no immediate discomfort demanding his attention, just a steady rhythm of days that were predictable enough to feel safe. And yet beneath that surface, something felt incomplete, not in a dramatic or alarming way, but in a quiet, almost unnoticeable way, like a faint signal that could easily be ignored if he chose not to look too closely. And that is exactly what made it so dangerous. Because unlike pain, which demands a response, comfort invites complacency. It encourages stillness. It whispers that where you are is good enough, that there is no need to disrupt what is already working. And for a while, he listened to that voice. He allowed himself to settle into the routine, to move through his days without questioning too much, to enjoy the absence of struggle. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. Nothing inherently negative about peace or stability. But what he began to realize over time was that this particular kind of comfort was not the same as fulfillment. It was not the result of alignment or growth. It was the result of adaptation, of learning how to exist within a space that no longer challenged him. And that distinction became clearer the longer he stayed there, because while everything on the outside appeared steady, something on the inside began to stagnate. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted his life immediately, but gradually, subtly, like a muscle that weakens when it is no longer used. And he could feel it, that slow decline in curiosity, in energy, in the sense of possibility that had once driven him forward. And it didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments, in the choices to stay where it was easy instead of exploring what was uncertain, in the decisions to maintain what was comfortable instead of risking what could be meaningful. And those moments accumulated, just like the small actions that had once built his momentum, only now they were building something different, something quieter, something that felt safe, but not alive. And that is when he began to understand that the greatest threat to growth is not failure, not difficulty, but the illusion of being fine. Because when things are clearly broken, there is a natural drive to fix them. But when things are simply okay, there is no urgency, no immediate reason to change. And that absence of urgency can keep a person in the same place indefinitely. Not because they lack potential, but because they lack the friction required to activate it. And recognizing this was unsettling, because it meant that the very place he had once seen as a destination was actually another kind of challenge, one that required a different kind of awareness, a different kind of courage. Not the courage to face pain, but the courage to question comfort, to look at his current situation and ask whether it truly reflected who he was capable of becoming, or whether it was simply a place he had learned to tolerate. And that question was not easy to answer, because it required honesty without justification. It required him to look beyond the surface and examine the deeper layers of his experience, to differentiate between what felt good in the moment and what felt meaningful in the long term. And as he did that, the answer became clearer, not through a single realization, but through a growing sense that something within him was not fully expressed, that there were parts of himself that had been set aside in exchange for stability, that there were possibilities he had stopped exploring because they required him to step outside the boundaries he had grown comfortable within. And once he saw that, truly saw it, he could no longer ignore it, because awareness changes the nature of choice. Once you recognize that you are settling, continuing to settle becomes a conscious decision rather than an unconscious habit. And that awareness brought him back to a familiar place, the edge of change. But this time, it felt different, because there was no external pressure pushing him, no crisis forcing him to act, only an internal understanding that if he stayed where he was, nothing would necessarily go wrong, but something important would be left unexplored. And that realization carried its own kind of weight, because it forced him to confront a deeper question, not about what he had to do, but about what he was willing to leave behind. And the answer to that question required him to reconnect with something he had touched on before, but not fully embraced. The idea that life is not just about maintaining what works, it is about expanding into what is possible. And that expansion does not happen automatically. It requires intention. It requires a willingness to disrupt comfort, to introduce challenge where none is required, to create movement where stillness would be easier. And that is not a decision that can be made lightly, because it involves stepping away from certainty, from familiarity, from the structures that provide a sense of control, and into something less defined, less predictable, and yet more aligned with growth. And as he stood there, considering this, he realized that the choice was not between comfort and discomfort. It was between stagnation and growth, between staying within the boundaries of what he already knew, or stepping into the unknown to discover what he was capable of. And that perspective reframed everything, because it removed the illusion that comfort was neutral, that staying the same had no cost, and replaced it with the understanding that every moment spent avoiding growth was a moment spent limiting potential. And that cost, though invisible in the short term, accumulates over time, shaping the trajectory of a life in ways that are often only recognized in hindsight. And he did not want to arrive at that point, to look back and realize that he had chosen safety over possibility, that he had allowed the absence of struggle to prevent the presence of meaning. And so he made a decision, not a dramatic or impulsive one, but a deliberate one, to step beyond what was comfortable, not because he was dissatisfied with what he had, but because he recognized that what he had was not the limit of what was available to him. And that decision reignited something within him, a sense of curiosity, of engagement, of forward movement that had been dormant. And as he began to act on it, to introduce small challenges, to question his routines, to explore new directions, he felt that sense of aliveness return, not as a constant state, but as a recurring experience that reminded him why growth mattered. And it became clear that meaning is not found in maintaining a steady state of comfort, but in the dynamic process of becoming, in the continual expansion of what you are capable of understanding, creating, experiencing, and contributing. And that process does not have a final destination. It is ongoing, evolving, shaped by the choices you make each day. And with that understanding, he no longer saw comfort as something to avoid entirely, but as something to move through, to appreciate without becoming attached to use as a place of rest rather than a place of permanence. And that distinction allowed him to engage with his life more intentionally, to seek out growth not out of dissatisfaction, but out of appreciation for the opportunity to become more, to experience more, to give more. And in doing so, he stepped fully into the role that had been waiting for him all along. Not as someone reacting to circumstances, not as someone settling for what was available, but as someone actively shaping his path, choosing movement over stillness, meaning over ease, and possibility over comfort. And that choice, repeated over time, became the defining force of who he was becoming.